All right, let's get right into it. Should you use should, or ought you to use ought to? You know, it's one of those classic English grammar puzzles, right? Well, today we're going to break down the subtle and, yeah, often confusing difference between these two little words.
And you know what? Let's start right here. This is a great comment from a grammar discussion on Reddit. A user, Ghost Mosquito, says, I personally think there isn't much of a difference. And let's be honest, a lot of us feel that way, right? In so many situations, these words just feel completely interchangeable. But is that the whole story? Is it really that simple? Let's dig a little deeper. Look beneath the surface and see if there's more to it. A distinction that can actually make our language more precise. Okay, so first up, let's talk about the simplest, most straightforward answer here. And it really all just comes down to one thing: formality.
Look, if you only remember one thing from all of this, let it be this right here. Should is your everyday go-to word. It's for advice, it's for suggestions. Ought to, well, think of it as its more formal, slightly stuffier cousin. You'll see it more in formal writing, but you won't hear it as much in casual conversation.
So this table here really lays it all out. You can see both are used to give advice, right? No difference there. But the real key is that common usage column. See how should is basically your everyday workhorse, and ought to is kind of saved for those more formal situations? That's a fantastic starting point for figuring out which one to grab. Okay, but it's not just about formality. There's another layer here, a more subtle shade of meaning that a lot of native speakers feel, even if they can't quite put their finger on it. We're talking about the difference between just giving some advice and a real sense of duty. And this comment from another Redditor, Tamatai, just hits the nail on the head. They say that ought to carries more moral weight. And that's it, right there. It's not just about what's a good idea, it's about what's the right thing to do.
And here's how you can actually put that into practice. This user, Willie_Quiote, lays it out perfectly. They use ought for obligation and should for just plain old practical advice. I mean, that's a brilliant rule of thumb.
So let's break that down. Should is really all about subjective advice. It's my opinion, right? It's a personal recommendation. The example here, you should check the oil in your car, is just good practical advice. Or think of it this way. If I say you should try that new restaurant, I'm just telling you what I think. I'm not giving you a moral command. Now contrast that with ought to. This one feels different. It often implies a duty that comes from somewhere else, from society or ethics or just a general sense of morality. We ought to respect our elders. That's not just a suggestion, is it? It feels much bigger, like a statement about our collective responsibility.
All right, let's get into the real nitty-gritty now, the actual grammar rules. Because how we build sentences with these words, well, that reveals some of the biggest, most important differences between them. So rule number one, and this one is simple, but it is absolutely non-negotiable. Should is always followed directly by the verb. You should go, no to. Ought, on the other hand, always needs that to before the verb. You ought to go. Getting this mixed up, saying something like should to go, is a super common mistake, so watch out for it. Okay, so positive sentences are pretty straightforward, but what about when we want to make them negative or ask a question? Well, this is where things get really interesting, and the gap between should and ought to gets a whole lot wider.
When it comes to negatives, there's a clear winner. It's should not or shouldn't. We use it all the time, right? Now, you can say ought not to or oughtn't to. Grammatically, it's correct. But honestly, you will almost never hear it spoken. It sounds super formal, almost like something out of a Charles Dickens novel or something.
And guess what? It's pretty much the exact same story with questions. Should I call? That's how we say it, period. Technically, you can say, ought I to call, but man, you are going to sound like you just stepped out of a time machine. For normal, everyday speech, should is the undisputed champion for asking questions.
So we've got a pretty clear picture now, right? Should is for subjective advice, ought to is for objective duty. Simple. But what if I told you it's not quite that simple? Come on, let's peel back one more layer here and see what the actual linguistic data says. This is where it gets really cool.
Okay, so linguists have this fancy term, source of modality. But don't worry, it's basically just asking, where does this feeling of have to or need to come from? If it's coming from the speaker's own opinion, it's subjective. But if it's coming from some outside rule or circumstance, then it's objective. Makes sense, right?
And here is the kicker.
A big analysis of how people actually use these words shows that both should and ought to are overwhelmingly subjective. Wait, what? Yeah, that means they both usually just represent the speaker's personal viewpoint. So that whole idea that ought to is the objective one, the data doesn't really back it up. It seems ought to is just a different flavor of subjective, a more formal, more moral-sounding flavor. Okay, wow. We have covered formality, moral weight, grammar rules, even some pretty deep linguistic data. So after all that, what's the simple, practical takeaway? What do you actually need to know for your everyday conversations?
All right, here it is, boiled down to the essentials. For pretty much all your everyday advice and opinions, you should. If you're writing something formal or you really want to add that extra punch of moral duty, then you can pull out ought to. But honestly, when in doubt, just go with should. It's almost always the safe bet. And for the love of grammar, please, never, ever say should to.
And that brings us to our final question, a little play on words for you. Now that you know the difference, should you try to use ought to more often? Or ought you to just stick with the simple power of should? Well, the choice, of course, is yours. But either way, now you know. And understanding that difference, well, that makes your English just a little more precise and a whole lot more powerful.
Hello, it's Rod's friend here, Gino from Real Everyday English. Sorry for interrupting your video. I just want to make a quick recommendation that you subscribe to Rodrigo's channel. He's an amazing guy, he's so humble, he's so dedicated, and he creates absolutely fantastic content. See you people soon. Bye-bye. God bless.